Hello, class. My name is Camille Williams, and my presentation is on origins of a riot, the unrest in Ferguson. Before I discuss the unrest in Ferguson, I want to give a brief history on law enforcement's contact with African Americans. Law enforcement has always had a fractured history when dealing with African Americans. It goes back many centuries back, even into slavery times, when law enforcement officers were tasked with the responsibility of ensuring that African Americans refrained from entering certain establishments and doing certain activities. They call these slave patrols. They were known as slave patrols because they came about after the slave rebellions of the late 17th and 18th century. Even after the ending of slavery, African Americans continued to be oppressed, but instead of slave patrols, we now had Jim Crow laws. These basically said that black people could only ride in the back of the bus or live in certain areas or eat at certain places. This, in essence, denied blacks from being truly equal in society. The frustration building in the black community finally came to a boiling point on August 11, 1965. This was during the height of the civil rights movement, so for the first time in American history, some serious change was happening. But it still wasn't happening fast enough. Not to mention the fact that it was met by a great deal of resistance by those in power, specifically law enforcement officers who during this time were the face of those most resistant to change. So back to August 11, 1965. On August 11th, a African American motorist, Marquette Fry, was arrested by the CHP for driving drunk. Somehow his mother and brother got involved. His mother began reprimanding Marquette for getting arrested for drunk driving. A commotion occurred. A shoving match between Marquette Fry, his mother, his brother, and the CHP occurred. All the while, an angry mob began to form. They began throwing rocks at the police officers. By the next day, this seemingly simple drunk driving arrest had turned into a full-blown riot. The riot lasted 6 days, by the end of which 34 people had been killed. The city ended up suffering $40 million in property damage as well. This riot became known as the Watts Riot, and it was the largest riot at that time. Now, some 50 years later, the frustration in the black community once again came to a boiling point, though this time someone had been killed. On August 9, 2014, Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson was on patrol. He received a call of a robbery that just occurred at the Ferguson Market and Liquor. Moments later, he saw Michael Brown and his friend Dorian Johnson walking down the middle of the street. Wilson quickly realized that Brown matched the description of the robbery suspect. He approached Brown and an altercation occurred. According to Wilson, Brown had attempted to reach for his gun, and that is when Wilson shot him. Other witness accounts claim that Brown had thrust his hands in the air in order to surrender, but Wilson shot him anyways. As the nation's media outlets got wind of the shooting, many in the black community, especially those in the predominantly black community of Ferguson, were arguably upset. On August 9th and 10th, several protests and memorials for Michael Brown took place. By day's end on August 10th, these protests began to turn violent. At least 12 businesses had been looted and vandalized that night, including a Quick Trip convenience store and gas station that was burned to the ground. The looting and vandalizing intensified over the next week until finally the governor of Missouri had to declare a state of emergency. 2 days later, he called up the National Guard. The initial wave of rioting continued for another week and only relented at the request of the Brown family. By the end of the riots, over 300 protesters had been arrested. The financial toll on the city is as yet unknown, but whatever it is only expected to rise due to the sporadic periods of civil unrest following the initial riot. To conclude, I would like to leave you with a final thought. Many have argued the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of rioting in order to bring about social justice. One thing we know for sure is that discrimination is real and it still adversely affects many communities. So we shouldn't refrain from discussing these controversial topics. Open discussion will hopefully prevent tensions from coming to a boiling point once again as they did in Ferguson. Thank you.